Goodness. One, two, three. Sojin, are you based at a museum?
You're far away from me.
Which museum are you based
I'm
out
not
of?
in a museum. I'm actually at a center. So
At a
the
center.
festival gets produced by the Smithsonian Center for Folk Life and Cultural Heritage.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Because we are able to Theo Gonzalez is a friend.
Theo and I were just in a session at OCA together.
Oh,
Yeah.
cool. They're hosting some members to
good.
promote his book. And
Great.
I think he organized some curators to bring out some of the items, the
Oh,
101 items
Yeah.
for us. So we're taking a field trip down there next
What day is
Saturday.
that?
Saturday the 22nd at what? Well, we're having people meet in the lobby at 1. And I think the program at the auditorium at the museum is at 2 or 2:30 start.
That is so cool. You know, the funniest thing is that one of the I contributed entries to the volume, and one of the ones that I worked on and which actually poor Theo was like up until literally 2 weeks ago didn't have the deed in hand were the press badges for KW Lee.
Yes.
And I felt so bad. So I just kept saying like, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. KW is having some issue. I mean, he's very old, right? But he's still kind of amazing.
He's very, yeah.
But so it took, he had actually given me all of this stuff like over 10 years ago, and it just hadn't made the right, it's my fault, but partly the museum did an exhibition and those went into the museum exhibit, but because it took so long to get them into the Smithsonian, they said it would be quicker if we just did a direct loan. And so instead of going straight to the Smithsonian, there was this pause. Anyway, KW Lee's press badges. I hope you see them.
That's iconic.
Yeah.
That's like, I just watched Free Chol Soli on a plane last month in May.
That's so great.
Because it was one of the United offerings for Heritage Month.
Love that.
Free
That
Chol
is
Soli,
cool.
Crazy Rich Asians, Shang-Chi, Yes, it was a good selection.
Wait, so that was Heritage Month they did that?
Uh,
Or did they just do that?
I remember there being like a heritage, like
On United,
Yeah,
yeah,
I remember.
they had a special curated list.
Okay, that's kind of
Hi.
great.
Yeah. Mics are we using?
Hi, everyone. It's really good to see you all. So I'm Nisha Karani. I serve as a co-treasurer on CAPAL's board of directors. So I want to, first thank you all for being here and welcome you all to CAPAL's Washington Leadership Program. And so today I have the honor of introducing the conversation we're going to have on AANHPI media representation and public service. To give a little bit of brief background on CAPAL, for those of you who may be unfamiliar, we are a nonprofit that cultivates Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander public service leaders by providing formative professional experience and growth opportunities through our annual public service scholarship and internship program, roundtable series, mentorship program, and tonight's Washington Leadership Program. WLP, Washington Leadership Program, is one of our signature free programs that introduces students to AANHPI leaders in public service who can inform and inspire students' own civic engagement. So for the second year in a row, this summer's WLP series planning was led by a group of our recent scholar and intern alumni, which is really great for being able to see and engage with our past scholars and interns, and it's really meaningful for us at CAPAL. A little bit of additional information about the WLP. So our WLP sessions are recorded and live streamed to our YouTube page, and they will be available for later viewing afterwards, including the materials. So, the past WLP sessions are on YouTube. This one will be available a little bit later as well. And so diving into today's session will be AANHPI media representation and public service. The session will feature AANHPI professionals working in the media and public service space. Topics of discussion include how to bridge media communications with advocacy and public service, and the importance and impact of AANHPI representation in media and the creative fields, as well as means to use media as tools of empowerment. I want to note that there will be an audience survey following the panel discussion, and we're going to ask all attendees to kindly fill out the responses. The survey helps support our WLP program, and it helps continue these programs year after year. Panelists will also be responding to audience question and answer at the end. So we invite attendees to stay after the session for our networking session, after the Q&A, after the survey, after all that. As you're following along today, we encourage you to follow and join the conversation on social media using the hashtag #WeAreCAPAL. Okay, and so thank you so much to our speakers for joining and spending their time with us and chatting with us this evening. We really appreciate it. I also want to give a special thank you to our 2023 sponsors, the DC Mayor's Office on Asian and Pacific Islander Affairs, MOAPIA, and Comcast for making programs like tonight's possible at CAPAL. Also, a tremendous thank you to AT&T for allowing us to host our WLP session at the venue space here tonight. It's lovely. It's great. Thank you so much. And finally, another thank you to Bonafide Masks for donating their materials in kind for our WLP sessions. Now, that's enough for me. So please give a warm welcome to our speakers tonight, Sojin Kim. Sojin will be moderating our session tonight. Sojin currently works as a curator for the Smithsonian Center for Folklife and Cultural Heritage and will be leading the discussion and the Q&A. So with that, Sojin, I'll let you take it from here.
Thank you so much. And can you guys hear me if I sit back like this? This is like such a fancy, I work very much in the domain of culture. This is very fancy and formal for me. So this is, okay, you can hear me? Excellent. So thank you very much. It's really my honor to be here. It's the work of CAPAL is so important, and I'm really, really excited to hear the discussion with my colleagues here. But I just want to start by a disclaimer, which is that, and our colleague online too, so I want to acknowledge, I do not work in the space of media. I work sort of adjacent to it. And I care, I mean, like all of you, we all recognize how important AANHPI representation in media is. It impacts all of us. So I'm thrilled to be able to hear from my colleagues who are doing, I think, really, really powerful work in this space where we have media and public service intersecting. So I'm very much looking forward to it. But so this is just to say that I work at the Center for Folklife and Cultural Heritage. We are a non-museum entity of the Smithsonian. We do maintain a major archive. We actually do exhibitions and media projects, and we also produce Smithsonian Folkways Recording, which is the nonprofit record label of the Smithsonian. But that's pretty much as close to media as I get in these things, very much in the space of intangible culture, and just working with communities to think about and engage and expand awareness and appreciation for how basically the power of culture and heritage just in our everyday lives. So I just, we thought that before we got started, so I'm gonna basically very quickly introduce who we are going to be hearing from, but I'm gonna have them introduce themselves with greater depth. And then after this initial introduction, though, we want to kind of pull the room because we want to understand who you are, so that as we are talking and responding to questions, we sort of know, again, who are we talking to, where are people situated in this topic, in the subject matter. So briefly, I just want to introduce the panelists. We have over here on the screen, we have Moana McAdams, who is the founder of Moana Nui Podcast and a creator, writer of Burning Spear. Thank you, Moana, for joining us. I'm not sure what you are seeing. Do you see the audience or do you just see the panel?
I see the panel.
Okay, so we'll have to report to you what we are hearing from the audience.
Okay.
And then we have at the far end, we have Naomi Takuyan Underwood, who is the Executive Director of Asian American Journalists Association, AAJA, which will be having their major conference starting next week. Next to Naomi, we have Davina Khanna, who is an economic policy advisor for a member of Congress at the U.S. House of Representatives, but she's also a political contributor to Brown Girl Magazine. And I think it's going to be really interesting to hear her talk about the intersection of these two different spaces that she's working in. And then next to me, we have Shauna Chen, who is a reporter for Axios and also the editor-in-chief of WLP. So again, I think another place where we'll have, how do you balance these different spaces that you're working in? I think it'll be really interesting to hear about that. But before we get started, and I know you guys are eating, so I hate to interrupt while you're eating, but we do want to know a little bit about who you are and who we're talking to. So I want to just ask, by a raise of hands, and Moana, we'll kind of yell out to you what we're seeing, so you know. But how many of you guys are actually from the DC area? How many of you are living, working, or studying in the DC? And this doesn't count because you're here right now. Just in general, for the bigger part of the year, how many of you live, work, study in DC? So that I would say, Moana, that's probably like a third of the room. So pretty large part. Okay, then how many of you are from DC originally, grew up here, based here? So very few actually from, so many people have come in here to DC to work or to be a part of this program. How many from the Mid-Atlantic region though? One outside of DC, one from the Mid-Atlantic region. Okay, how about from New England? So two. How about from south of Virginia, let's say? Whoa, no one. Okay, oh, maybe, sort of. And then how about Midwest? Midwest, what states? Ohio? Indiana, okay, and I realize the Midwest is really big, so thank you for specifying. How about the Intermountain region? Colorado, Wyoming, Montana, anyone here from there? Nah. Okay. Southwest? No one. California? Okay. So yeah, at least about maybe a third quarter from California. How about Pacific Northwest? No one from the Pacific Northwest. Okay. And then Hawaii or Hawaii? Guam. One from Hawaii. No, Guam. Oh, Guam. Okay. So Pacific Islands. Okay. So and then, do we miss anyone? Is there another region? Are there people from outside US territories? Oh, okay. Excellent. Where are you guys from?
I grew up in
Hong Kong.
I grew up in India.
In India. Okay, wonderful. So it's actually an interesting cross section. There are some regions totally unrepresented by the room, but there is actually some interesting range. And then I'm wondering how many of you are majoring in a subject or doing work that you would consider directly related to today's topic. So you're doing media studies, media making, journalism, Asian American or Pacific Island studies. So there's like a half hand raise at this table. So maybe that's actually but maybe like 5 people raise their hand, Moana. And then how about people working directly in the arts? Anyone working in art making, art history, arts management, arts admin? So no one directly in creative industries. And then how many of you are studying and planning to work in a sector not directly related to at all or adjacent to the topic of tonight? So a handful. But again, I think that is cool because we know this topic, you know, how we are represented in media, in popular culture, in public discourse matters and impacts all of us. So it is a discussion that pertains to all of us. Anyway, thank you for that. I feel like we know a little bit better who we have here. And so what we want to do now is get started and have our colleagues here tell us more about the work that they're doing. And what I wanted to do is ask each in turn. And Moana, is it okay if we start with you? I wanted to ask everyone to introduce themselves with the details, with the details that you'd like to share with this group about who you are, what drew you to work in the areas and issues surrounding media and or the arts. And also if you could talk a bit about your pathway, the pathway towards public service, media and arts. And I'm wondering if we could start with Moana and then maybe go to the end and go this way from Naomi.
Sure. Aloha, everyone. Thank you so much for giving me an opportunity to come and speak with you all. My name is Moana McAdams, and I was born and raised in the islands of Hawaii. My pathway to public service is I was recruited while I was still in college at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. But it wasn't for public service. It was in public service, but it wasn't for media or arts or any of that. Some of that stuff came later. My degree background is in computer science, information technology, and business. And so that's what I, was hired to do in the federal government. I've been there for 25 years now, working in the IT space and trying to help with national security issues. But in terms of my culture and who I am and my identity and my pathway, advocacy and working on behalf of a community is a huge part of Hawaiian culture. Each and every one of us as Kanaka have a kuleana or a responsibility to act on behalf of our community. And so that's always been very close to me, even before I entered public service. So it's kind of a natural pathway for me to end up serving the public. When I moved to the DC area, though, I didn't see a lot of Native Hawaiian or Pacific Islanders. And so over the years, I've maintained connectivity to my home here in the islands and just trying to be a voice and an extension of our community in the DC area and trying to help build connections and relationships, in the area where I am. And so staying connected to the community issues, I return home once annually, at least once, because it's a very important part of who I am and what I love to do. Over time, I started working in media and arts in the last 8 to 10 years, I would say. My husband and I have established a small business, publishing, entertainment, and media related business. And we have our own comic book series, a children's book series that is bilingual in both English and Hawaiian to put these resources back into our communities here in Hawaii. And our media platform is the Moana Nui podcast, where we uplift and amplify the voices of the AANHPI community in so many different spaces. We find that while, we can't always find people if you say like it's going to be a political event or depending on how you frame the event. But when you talk about pop culture and media, that's something where you can find people from all walks of life and using those commonalities in those fandoms to build those relationships and open up new avenues for conversation and resources to tackle the challenges of our communities.
Thank you so much. Naomi.
Hello, everyone. I'm Naomi. I'm Executive Director of AAJA, and I will start out with saying that I have never been a practicing journalist. I do say my first love is journalism because I actually went to school to study journalism. I have a degree in it. And from an early age, I remember seeing what role journalists played in how to bring down a dictatorship. I'm Filipina, so in the 80s, there was a dictatorship, and journalists played a very big role in bringing down that dictatorship and bringing back free and fair elections in the Philippines. And that really made an impact on me. So my first love is journalism. I went to study it, but my senior year in college, 9/11 happened. And as a member of the Asian American community, you could almost predict what kind, even back then, and knowing our history, you could almost predict what kind of backlash that would have on certain parts of our community and all of us as a whole. And I decided then journalism is great. It has a role to play in reporting and storytelling and holding folks accountable, but that's not enough. So I actually made a decision to move to DC. I packed up a rent-a-car and moved to DC and said, I want to be working in policy. And I was very lucky because DC has a wonderful AAPI nonprofit advocacy community that took me in and mentored me. And I think what I find interesting about all our paths is they're neither linear nor simple, right? So as I learned about the nonprofit advocacy community, I also learned you can't just advocate for issues and not be involved in the elected officials and the policymakers who end up making these decisions and writing the laws. And I ended up becoming more and more involved in civic engagement, voter rights, and even to a certain extent, political campaigns. So it wasn't very linear at all. Like I didn't know what kind of path I would have when I moved to DC. All I knew is that I wanted to work in policy. Fast forward, I got to work on Capitol Hill for my home territory of Guam. And this position at AAJ opened up, and I thought, what an opportunity to be surrounded by the journalists that I wanted to be. And I always tell my board members, it's been an honor and a privilege to take all of the skills and all of the mentoring that I benefited from and be able to apply it towards AAJ's mission. So a little bit about AAJ's mission is that we are a membership organization, about 2,000 strong, both here in the United States and across Asia as well. And our mission really is to increase diversity and inclusion in newsrooms in order to also make sure that the AAPI community is represented well, is reported on equitably and accurately. And I've been ED at AAJ since 2019. Some of our programs include our key programs as part of our mission include leadership programs such as this, where we work with high school students, college students, as well as mid-career folks to build their leadership capacities. Another one is the really important one that has played such a part in the last 3 years has been our media watch work. AAJA, once Atlanta happened, AAJA sprung into action, and we knew that there was a high possibility of newsrooms not getting the reporting right and making assumptions and incorporating implicit biases into the reporting. And AAJA, as part of our media watch work, released a guide that basically went point by point on how to cover Atlanta and how not to cover Atlanta and the AAPI communities. So coupled with our leadership programs, our media watch is really pivotal in terms of what we see as our role in the dialogue and in the policy and narrative sphere of ensuring that API communities are represented well. And you mentioned our convention. We do have a convention next week, Building Our Collective Power. We're very excited. Minjin Lee is going to be the keynote speaker because our president decided to give her a President's Award for her role in bringing together like different worlds and different sectors. So very excited. It's going to have a lot of training, a lot of community building. We're trying very hard to be intergenerational. We're 40 years old. So how do we build on the legacy of 6 Asian American journalists in Los Angeles looking around a newsroom and noticing that there definitely needed to be more AAPIs. So we're very honored, Shauna and I, to continue this work in the ways that we do.
Yeah, thank you. Nina.
Great. Well, I will preface my story by first saying that until maybe 2 years ago, I never thought that I'd be sitting on a panel with the title media or art at all. I've spent the last decade working in financial services policy, economic policy, consumer protection, and financial regulation. So very separate from anything related to media or the arts. But first, how did I get to economic policy? I have always been interested in politics and public service, even starting at a very young age. I remember the first election I remember was Bush v. Gore, and following the drama in Florida and being very excited about how our electoral process works. When I was in high school, I had the privilege of participating in an Asian American civic youth participation program that put me in an internship in my community, and I got to meet other peers, 16, 17-year-olds that were like me, that looked like me and had my interests. That was a really unique opportunity that kickstarted more of my passions. I grew up in Cupertino, California, and if you're familiar with the Bay Area, it's a very privileged community, but it was also for me very much a pressure cooker community. There was a big focus on academics, on SAT scores, and I thought my only 2 career options were to either go to medical school or become an engineer, which are of course wonderful options, but to me, it felt like a trap. I felt very limited. And the thought of telling my parents that I wanted to major in political science was probably the most intimidating conversation I've had with them till date. Now, of course, they're very proud of me. They're very thrilled that I followed my career path. But it was always an area that I knew that I wanted to be. My senior year in high school was when Barack Obama was running for office, and I wasn't old enough to vote, but I went and I got all my neighbors registered. I was so excited about that election. I had a fantastic government teacher that took our class to Washington, D.C., and I knew from that day on that that was the city that I wanted to live in. I couldn't see any other life for myself. And so fast forward, I went to public policy school, chose economics. I'm a child of the 2008 financial crisis, and I was just horrified by seeing the ways in which the financial industry really took advantage of people. We talk a lot about financial literacy and financial education, and frankly, I don't think there's enough onus at looking at the industry itself and the ways in which it takes advantage of people, particularly immigrants, people of color, people like my parents that didn't understand the credit reporting process as new immigrants. And I wanted to attack it head on. So I worked for a number of years for a financial regulator. I came to Capitol Hill, where I get to continue on those projects. And I absolutely love the work. But how does that get me to media and the arts? So about 5 years ago, I came across a publication called Brown Girl Magazine. And at the time, they were publishing articles that reflected stories and op-eds that showed South Asian women as more than just brown women interested in Bollywood. It showed us as multidimensional people that had interests, that had real problems, that needed places to discuss them. So I started reading stories about South Asian queer women coming out to their families, or how they handled something like the taboo of alopecia, or how they would walk into a Sephora and not see any skincare products or colors that match their own skin, and how they maybe decided to start a makeup line because of that. So from time to time, I would contribute stories, and I would be so thrilled that they would get published. And the 2020 election came around. And of course, we had Kamala Harris, a South Asian woman, as our vice president. So I approached the CEO and I said, hey, you have a platform. You have 200,000 Instagram followers. You have such a unique opportunity here to really get out the South Asian vote, and not just the South Asian youth vote, I'm talking all of our demographics. How do we get our people out to vote? And she handed me the platform and we ran with it. We were holding webinars. We were holding, and remember, this was COVID. So everything we were doing was virtual. We were doing phone banking. We were getting aunties out to do chai and postcard writing parties, right? Sending them out to their neighbors. I mean, my mother, I think she had voted because I used to help her fill out her ballot, but she was excited. She was getting her friends out. So following the election, we thought, wow, we need to do something with this momentum. And in the last midterm election, I think we probably featured over 100 South Asian women that were running at the local level. We're going for federal appointments. We're representing their community at the school board level. We're representing communities that have historically had no representation. I'm talking about like Sikh taxi cab drivers in New York and having a Sikh woman be elected to the New York City City Council. That's a huge deal. So how can we be continuing to amplify these stories? So Trisha about a year ago said, hey, I need you to take on more. So she made me, I think the title we came up with at the time was political director. Right now it's DC lead. And in the last year, I've been covering more South Asians that are getting elected, not just getting elected to office, but getting appointed. I've also been covering some of the really touchy and divisive issues with our community. So I'm sure many of you heard in the news a couple of weeks ago, India's Prime Minister Modi came to the US for a state visit. And that is a very divisive topic. He's a very controversial figure. And we were very thoughtful of how do we cover this. So again, like I said, I'm an economic policy advisor / a Brown Girl magazine contributor. And I've always felt that slash. I've always felt that divide. And how could I work to bridge that divide? So I walked into my congressman that I work for, his office, and I said, hey, I know we have a hearing next Thursday, but I don't know if you heard, but Prime Minister Modi is visiting, and I also write for this publication. Can I miss the hearing to go cover the protests? And he said, you absolutely should be there. And by the way, what letters can I sign on to help your cause and the causes that you're interested in? And that was sort of this aha moment of me of, I don't have to be slash, maybe I can be and, maybe I can be or. And how can I be bringing my whole self into every room that I walk into? So that was a very long roundabout way of just sharing my story from economic policy into media and the arts.
Thank you, Shauna.
So I probably have the least amount of career experience out of everybody here. I started working at Axios about 2 weeks right before the 2020 election. So it was chaotic. It was kind of chaotic is really kind of the only word to describe it. Yeah, and then months after, I had actually, wanted to become a journalist since I was in high school. I'd always loved writing and grew up in China and then, came back to the States, Bay Area, and finished high school there. And then joining this high school paper there. And that was when I realized, the power that journalism holds, and also how it can, in both good and bad ways, I'll say it that way. So, that was where I first understood, systems operating against certain communities. For me, it was a particular protest held by parents of students with disabilities who were, calling out the district for neglecting their kids. And it was also where I, realized how national media can also try to come in and really destroy a community in many ways. So I grew up in Palo Alto, and there was we had a number of student suicides in the area, and a good number of them were Asian American. So it was very easy for national media to come in and then be like, oh, it's these Asian tiger parents who are just trying to kill their kids. And that spun into a huge narrative. You'd see it all over the comment section, online. So in this story, it was national. People, when I moved to the East Coast for college, people would ask me about it when I said where I'm from, and so it is I think that's the part of journalism that is important for anybody in media to really grasp is just the line of, you know, how exactly you can wield it. And so when I went to college, I majored in English. I went to a liberal arts college, but I knew I wanted to do journalism. So I continued with the school paper. It was very, very interesting. I started school about the time that Trump was elected in 2016. So we kind of went through a bunch of the cycles of like what the policies that he was putting out meant for people on campus. And then in 2019, I was in DC, I was interning, and then there was a group of, you know, back when Facebook was still a thing, there was like a group of Asian American college students who would like, you know, get together from time to time through a Facebook group that was like really, really long, you know, name about interning in DC, whatever. And it was through that group that I actually met the two founders of the YAPI, which is, does anybody actually know the reference for that? Does anybody know Wong Fu in this room? Okay, yeah, so they did a TV series like a couple of years ago. We kind of ripped off them, sorry to Wong Fu. But they, you know, the whole point of the YAPI was like young Asian professionals, like yuppie, but yappy. And so the whole point of that series was to kind of like expand, you know, Yappy's understanding of politics and advocacy and like the issues that affect our community. It's a great series. It's like, I mean, it's, you know, looking back on it now, of course, there's some elements that are dated, but like it was a big jumping point for a lot of us because, you know, we didn't grow up with, you know, seeing ourselves in media, right? And we didn't see our stories told that way. And we certainly didn't see the kinds of nuances between communities in subgroups. And so Andrew and Andrew, they're both the two founders of YAPI are both Andrews. So they had decided that, you know, oh, like we don't see any kind of news outlet that just focuses on API politics and policy. You know, we have a lot of like, you know, community news outlets through specific, you know, languages, but not really something that's solely devoted to like what happens in DC and how it kind of trickles down, you know? And so we all started a weekly newsletter that ended up spiraling into something much bigger just because the demand was there. You know, even people in Congress and congressional offices, people in the White House were reaching out to us because we were filling in a niche, like, you know, need. And I think that's also where I came to realize, like, you know, we all grow up, you know, racialized in certain ways, but we're all racialized also in such different ways, right? Like, you know, Chinese Americans, Indian Americans versus Native Hawaiians, it's all so different. And so that was something that we really wanted to understand in our work and really bring out to people, not just how, you know, this policy is affecting Asian Americans or APIs, but breaking it down, you know, how does it affect Pacific Islanders differently from, you know, like Vietnamese Americans? What are the range of political views that different groups have and why is it? So that's kind of how it started. And then I've been doing that since 2019 alongside my work at Axios, where I've been able to cover a lot of, you know, Asian American related news stories as well. So yeah, that's kind of, yeah, I'm really grateful to be able to be here with everyone else.
Thank you, everyone. And I think that it was pointed out earlier, and I think it's so interesting to hear all of you exemplify this in your personal stories, just the way that these routes to the work that you're doing in this very complicated space is not one that's been direct. It has taken these different turns and different sources of inspiration. And something struck me when Davina was talking about this idea of being a slashy identity. And I'm wondering, Moana, I feel like you also have a similar, you know, you're not working as a journalist in the same ways that, or in the space of journalism like Naomi and Shauna. So I'm just wondering if there's something that you could riff on too, in terms of how you've been managing and balancing between your vocation and your avocation.
Yeah, I mean, I would say early on, it was very difficult because, you know, I was really trying to understand myself in my own space and then my community. And when you talk about the Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander community in the federal government, there aren't a whole lot of us. I think our percentage is like maybe 0.5%, right? So, you know, to a certain degree, when you are isolated, you know, so much, and you come from a community that is where community support is such a huge part of your life, there is this huge gap that in terms of identity, like you're trying to figure out, you know, what makes sense. When is it the right time to speak up? When is it the time to listen and observe and, you know, find the right pathways for you to take? But I think, you know, as with everything, with life, with growth, with experience, you know, you become more comfortable in who you are. And now, like, I speak up a whole lot more than I would have, you know, early in my career. I'm not afraid. I can more easily embrace my whole self and everything that I bring to the table. Because what I've found out over time is that there is so much ignorance, and I don't mean that necessarily in a negative way, but lack of education, lack of information about Native Hawaiian issues, Pacific Islander issues. One, because of the size of our community, but also two, geographically, it's so remote and distant, and it's not accessible to a lot of people. So it really, really becomes important for the voices like mine, even if it is a small, you know, small in number. It's important for you to voice those concerns of your community and just help educate other people about it. Because, you know, especially when you're working in policy and in public service, like we want to inform our decision makers and make sure they have access to that information, because they do have the power to impact not just decisions that are made right now, but strategically for generations to come. And when you talk about the Native Hawaiian community, it's still, we have a lot of issues that are, you know, our kingdom was overthrown in the late 1900s, and our statehood was only in 1959. And still, you know, like to this day, we have a lot of cultural issues, a lot of land issues that we are consistently fighting for. Actually, yesterday I sat in on a county government level meeting about developers here that are desecrating our sacred spaces. You know, we have ancient burial grounds that are being detonated in order to put condominiums into some of our communities, with no regard for our community, nor the infrastructure and that is required to you know, do this properly. So, you know, back to what I was saying earlier, I come home a lot because, you know, to be connected to this community, you have to be among any community, right? You have to be immersed into the culture, immersed in, you know, with the people, and really understand, especially now as technology changes our lives so quickly, you know, the issues can change overnight. And in order to stay connected, you know, you have to do what you can. I can't be here all the time, but I am blessed that my job affords me the opportunity to be able to still work on behalf of my community and also extend its voice and its access to resources in the DC area and in rooms where my community is not often found.
Thank you. And you said something, you talked about being in community, and I want to pose this to everyone, all of the panelists here. This idea of when you're using media, the difference between, or if you could address the difference between when you're using media in community, right, to communicate among oneself or to mobilize community, versus when you're using media to amplify voices and take them out and put them in front of people who might not otherwise have be exposed to a range of perspectives. And I'm wondering again, like, I feel like Shauna, probably most in your work, you have that direct distinction between the two things that you're working on.
Yeah, I think, you know, the audience for Axios and the AANHPI are obviously like very, very different. You know, Axios, kind of a national publication, very much so focused on politics in the mainstream kind of sense, whereas the AANHPI is, you know, we started off as a newsletter for, you know, Asian American and Pacific Islander professionals in the DC area, kind of expanded into looking at just like political stories that really involve and center APIs. So, you know, when I'm writing for Axios, of course, there's some times where I have to remind myself that a lot of the issues that our community understands, not everybody else does. And so having to explain, you know, certain things, you're like writing essentially to like a different person, right? If you're thinking about like you're writing to your mom versus your dad or your sister versus your brother, like it's essentially that. And so there is a sense sometimes, especially when I started out, because that was, you know, before the Atlanta spa shootings. And there was a growth in, you know, APIs in the space, but I think we just still weren't really covered, very, very much so, outside of maybe, you know, oh, there's an increase in hate crimes. And so, yeah, a lot of my job then with the national audience is to explain, and to try to explain in a way that, you know, but that still gets across that, like, these people are different because of the way they've been treated, not because of, you know, inherent biological differences or, you know, inherent kind of like, you know, personality differences from everybody else. And so I think that's been the main thing. And then with YAPI, of course, there are like somewhat different challenges within the same realm, like, you know, different subgroups of APIs have different needs and different understandings of other groups' issues. So I think that has been a privilege for me to be able to explore a lot more of those stories, even as a journalist, because, you know, my experience primarily growing up, right, was a Chinese American person. And so getting to understand that, like, you know, for like, you know, refugees, the experience is very, very different. And like the issues that affect them are also very, very different. That in of itself is also like important work for, I think, everyone who reads, but also who writes for people. So that's kind of how I see it. Do you guys have any other comments?
Yeah, I think the way AAJA sees our role is how do we see ourselves vis-a-vis and as part of the AAPI community? I think as a professional association, technically, and especially with the tenets of journalism, journalists tend to stand apart, and, you know, the construct of objectivity is still very much a standard, even though that's being questioned now, right? So in terms of journalists, we see our role as we know the media, and vis-a-vis community, one of our programs is how do we assist community members to be media savvy and know media relations and be media ready. And the other side of that too is AJ also sees ourselves as the ultimate advocate for journalists, AAPI journalists and journalists of color who may or may not be comfortable speaking out, or they have spoken out, but they're working against a lot of institutional barriers and biases, right? I remember when we released our guidance on the Atlanta shootings, we were hearing two things from our members. One of them was, my editors and my producers are telling me that I might be too biased or too close to the story because I'm Asian American. Or two, you're Asian American, you must know everything about this, right? So it's kind of a double-edged sword, and we're here to sort of provide that cover and provide the advocacy and educate newsrooms, and to be able to work with them in a collaborative manner to correct their behavior and really educate them on, you have to, you know, rethink objectivity, and you have to really realize what kind of assets journalists of color are in your newsroom, and build that community and be able to speak for journalists who are in positions of power to speak up the way an organization can. So very much like, how do we see ourselves as part of the community? What can we contribute to the larger API community? We also have a guide to covering Asian America. We are revising it right now, and we're hoping to release it in May of 2024. How do we see ourselves as part of a community? And also, how do we build a community of journalists where our members see themselves as more than the sum of our parts, right? We're more than just an association. We're really a community nationwide, backing each other up and really having a national organization to speak for the membership.
Thank you. Lavina, is there anything that you wanted to add to that, or shall I move on to another question?
Yeah, I think I'll just go back to Moana made the statement about learning to bring your whole self into rooms. And I really believe that that's an evolution. I don't think that happens immediately overnight. I think that takes time to feel like you can do that. I know in my space, I, especially early on in my career, felt like I needed to assimilate with whiteness to a degree. And I think that, being of the identities that I am able to do that. Or even if it was like learning what football team was playing in the playoffs so I could participate in the water cooler talk. I mean, how many people can relate to that? How could I, start to embrace or maybe just own or just mention my own story, and how could I be bringing my own lived experiences and the experiences of my communities or communities that were getting no representation at all into those circles. I was working on a rulemaking team related to the payday loan industry, which is a very high cost loan, very predatory product. And I was looking around the room and it was entirely white. I was the only person of color. I've never taken out a payday loan in my life. I know that none of the people in the room had. And I remember, this was early in my career thinking, well, maybe like the people that make decisions don't need to have experience with the product. And I tried to like justify it in my head like that. And, now like 10 years later, I'm able to realize, well, when I'm including people in those rooms, how am I ensuring that their lived experiences are represented? And am I asking the right questions of who are we not including? And am I asking the right people those questions? So I do think that takes some time. And with Brown Girl, it's really helped me embrace that, be able to tell my boss, hey, I work for this publication and there are current events that are affecting our community, but other communities as well. Can we take a stand? So I will say, I think that does sometimes come with time to build that confidence, but I really wish that I had spoken up in some of those rooms earlier. I really wish that I had asked those questions because really there was nobody else to do that.
I just want to continue along that line then and pose this to everyone again, is just thinking about obstacles. What are some of the biggest or most persistent obstacles that you all are facing in the work that you're trying to do?
I think for me, it's pretty obvious. Again, we talked about Axios versus the AANHPI. So there have been, and like in every predominantly white newsroom, there are things that come up, microaggressions, things that people say, headlines that, just shouldn't have been published, things like that. And even just like people in the process of trying to learn, but messing up along the way, right? And most of it is not malicious, but still the impact on the people or like who are, of that community, of that background is real. So there have been like many moments where I got really frustrated because, certain people just didn't understand why a particular story mattered because it didn't impact everybody. It didn't impact white people, right? That was kind of the main implication. And then on other times when like people just like said slurs that probably shouldn't have been said because they didn't realize they shouldn't say that. They didn't realize the history of it. And part of that is also just lack of education in general across this country, right? Like I didn't grow up reading about Asian Americans, Pacific Islanders in textbooks. We had one paragraph on Japanese American incarceration during World War II, and that was like it. And so I think that's definitely something that I've had to navigate, kind of like what you were talking about, learning, it is like tricky because I think when I first started, I wanted so badly to be able to speak up whenever I felt like I could, or whenever I felt like I needed to. But a lot of, the reality for a lot of people, in these spaces is that like, there is a minus a lot of times, right? There is a minus that comes with it. But I think for me personally, like what has been, helpful is being able to dive into those issues in a much more like nuanced manner with the AANHPI, because I know that audience gets it. And I know that the people I work with there like get it. And they were on the same team as me, right? Like we're all trying to better cover the wide variety of stories that impact Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. And I don't think that people at Axios don't agree with that or don't like align themselves with that mission. But it's just harder just because of a lot of the ways that systems have been set up for, coverage of Asian Americans to fail. And so I think that's kind of the main thing. But I will say, a big part for me of learning how to navigate, those different spaces is mentorship from older, Asian Americans, older Pacific Islander journalists who are willing to take that time and invest in me, help me like understand, how to actually like harness the power of your voice and use it to communicate properly, or not properly, but I think communicate in a way that gets the point across, rather than kind of, set off certain stereotypes that other people might think, like try to impose. And it's difficult because like in an ideal world, like I wouldn't have to do that, right? Like in an ideal world, I have to think through all of that, but that's just how it is. And until there are more Asian American and Pacific Islander journalists in this industry, until like people pay more attention to these issues in these stories, it is gonna be like that. And I will say that AAJ also has been a huge resource for me in that regard, just helping me kind of understand, like as a professional journalist in these, different newsrooms, how do I mold myself so that I can be as impactful as I can be, even if that is limited.
Really, really great dialogue here. I'm going to take that one step further in terms of, learning how to speak up. I think the further challenge to that is when you do speak up, what are you trying to accomplish? What are your goals, right? And for me, for both myself professionally, as well as for the AAPI community, I think a focal point of how we should be thinking about obstacles is messaging and persuasion. Right. I'm 5'1" before gravity kicks in the morning. I found myself in very similar spaces as you. I'm a petite Asian woman, especially on Capitol Hill, right? A petite Asian woman surrounded by, frankly, like tall white men. I represent a territory. We have no voting power on the floor. We can only do things in committee. Territories are so far removed from most members' imagination, even more than Hawaii, right? To a certain extent, both geographically and in terms of statute. And when I started on the Hill, I was more seasoned than just, coming out of college. And I really had to, every room I entered, I always had to ask myself, if no one says anything or thinks about the territories, what points do I need to make? What goes unsaid that it's my responsibility to make those points? What questions don't get asked? And depending on the meeting, who do I need to persuade and what kind of message do I need to think about to persuade them or make them think about things differently? And I think the same goes for the API community. I think the same goes when journalists like Shauna are writing a piece, is considering your audience, considering how you want to persuade or move them to action or thinking differently. And I think that's an extension of when we challenge ourselves to speak up in these spaces where it may not be the most comfortable or accommodating to our lived experiences. I remember the one of the big bills that I worked on, my member, because we're a territory, we worked on the Committee on Natural Resources, like very obtuse, not the best, like not the committee that anyone who wants to be a policy, expert works on, but that's the territories are under that committee's jurisdiction. And there was a bill that the progressives were trying to pass, and it was all about, of course, natural resources. We want to preserve our like fishing and make sure like nothing's going on in the EEZ. And the Democrats' message around it was really food security. And that wasn't resonating on the other side of the aisle. And we did some research and we find out that the illegal fishing that was going on, there was also a lot of other illegal activities going on those boats. So we made it about regional security and we connected it to what was going on in the Gulf of Mexico. And ultimately that persuasion campaign, I'll call it, managed to convince enough members to make it bipartisan and to get it through committee and to get it on the Hill unopposed. And it really was about finding the people you needed to persuade and how you needed to persuade them.
So for Moana and Zavina, because I'd love to hear from you guys as well. I wanted to also spin it based on what Shauna and Naomi were talking about. So either obstacles or opportunities.
So I know that Brown Girl often, one of the challenges that our CEO faces is convincing investors that our publication isn't niche, that it's not just for a small community. And she really struggles with that. And so do I think a lot of the community that she helps to build. She has built this incredible community of South Asian small business owners. We call it slashies. So this is a term that she coined, is that you'll often hear stories of a woman saying, well, I'm an accountant at at Deloitte slash I also am a writer, or slash I'm a musician, or slash I'm trying to start my own fashion line with Indo-Western wear, right? And I think that a lot of the women in our community have struggled with, how do I make my product? How do I make my story? How do I make my art mainstream? How do I get the world to see it and not just be viewed in this small way? And I think we've certainly had some success stories. I love, I walk into a Sephora and I see live tinted. Everybody loves that there are finally hue sticks that match my skin color and match everybody's colors. I'm very amused when I hear white coworkers talking about the coconut oil mask that they're putting in their hair that they paid $7 for, that my mom was getting a whole case for $7. And so it's very interesting to see how some of the ways in which we have maybe been made fun of, or our products, our stories have been seen as very small, are now becoming mainstream. I saw an article today from the Juggernaut about meditation and the appropriation of meditation by the West, and how meditation app companies that were being run by South Asians were not getting funding, but Headspace and Calm, which were owned by white people, were getting funding. So that continues to be a challenge, but I really do believe that community is the opportunity. It's why Trisha brings all the slashies together, and she does an annual slashy summit where all of these small business owners, they come together. The theme last year was community over competition. How can we be leveraging each other's brands? How can we be elevating one another? And I truly believe that goes beyond business. I believe that goes into politics, into public service, into journalism. How are we uplifting each other? And then also, how are we looking at our community as a whole? We're a very diverse community, and we often get grouped in together. With the affirmative action decision that was just completed in the Supreme Court, I really think that these are conversations we need to be having. How are we as a community standing in solidarity and appreciating our unique differences? I really think we need to be having more conversations there.
Thanks for that. And then to close off this part of the session, before, I think there's a survey and then Q&A, you'll have an opportunity for Q&A. Moana, I was wondering if you could close us off, either obstacles or opportunities in the media producing space that you work in.
Yeah, I want to foot stomp that message about standing in solidarity. That is a very key thing that we should be focused on, especially when we're talking about communities of color, all of which who are underrepresented and under-resourced. How can we build coalitions? How can we build partnerships, learn from one another, what has worked and what can we adapt to our unique community needs? There are so many challenges, right? But I'm glad you brought in the opportunities part as well, because if you only look at the challenges, you can get a little defeated in the work because it can be overwhelming. But I mean, for myself and even other organizations that I have learned about and worked alongside, I think resources are always a challenge. Again, when you're talking about under-resourced communities, a lot of folks are simply like trying to survive, especially here in Hawaii, where the cost of living is absolutely ridiculous and it's not getting any better. So like for the meeting that I was in yesterday, for example, there was probably about 50 people in the room. But I know that there are people in this community who would be standing up and wanting to have their voices heard, but they're at work, and they just don't have that privilege to come in and have their voices heard on a work day because they're trying to maintain their income to feed their family. I would also say resources from a perspective of the folks actually doing the work. And so that's another reason why coalitions become important around common causes and common challenges across different communities. In terms of opportunities, I mean, I can say that, you know, this is challenging and difficult work, but persistence and resilience is something that I am very proud of, coming out of a community who faces, you know, endless amounts of challenges.
We were almost
Now being in leadership positions, you know, I'm able to navigate a lot of challenges where folks who come out of, let's say, white, you know, the dominant culture, they wouldn't have these solutions because they don't know what it's like to really like scrape the bottom of the barrel and try to figure out how to help you, your family, your community, the program, whatever it is that you're managing, survive with little amounts of resources. And so by being resilient and really just pushing forward with a passion for the community, you know, I am starting to see other organizations within the community approaching our podcast to obtain sponsorships, other people who are interested in the work. I have a public mainstream publishing company who's approaching me to write Pacific Islander stories and perspectives. And so for me, it's both a challenge and an opportunity, which is scalability, right? How do you take it from, as the previous speaker was mentioning, something that is perceived as niche, but showing, you know, that it is much more widespread and much more relatable to a wider audience. But that does take the capacity, right? So the ability to build capacity is another challenge and opportunity that I think we have. And I think just, you know, for those who are sitting in the audience and are wondering, like, so how do we get involved? And, you know, if I am interested in this, you know, I would say, don't wait for anybody to tell you that it's okay to get involved. Like, find what, you know, what you align with, what you're passionate about, familiarize with the people who are doing the work, reach out, network, you know, and find opportunities to connect and see where your expertise, your skills, you know, can be applied, because there's never a shortage of work in this space.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I appreciate just across all four of you, the way in which you've talked about so much the importance of being proactive and looking forward and finding the need and the niche and the solution. So thank you guys for all of that. I'm gonna kick it over to our host now at this point, and then I think we're gonna follow up with Q&A.
Okay, first of all, can you guys hear me? Okay, perfect. First of all, let's give a huge round of applause for our amazing panel tonight. So Sojin, Moana, Shauna, Davina, Naomi, thank you so much for your insightful comments and just the stories and experiences that you shared tonight. So very shortly, we will be going into an audience Q&A, but beforehand, we will be handing out copies of our audience survey. Your responses, your feedback are hugely appreciated. We are not lying when we say that your responses are the reason why we are able to have support and funding for programs like these. So we would really appreciate your responses for the survey. So we'll take 5 minutes to complete the survey. When you are completed, feel free to just leave them at the table and we will pick them up afterwards. For our virtual attendees, I will be dropping the link to the survey in the Zoom chat very shortly. And then also for our virtual attendees, if you have any questions, please drop them in the chat box and then I will be sharing them to our panelists very shortly. For our in-person attendees, there should be microphones on each of your tables. If you have a question, feel free to raise your hand and then you can go ahead and turn on the button on the microphone and you should be able to ask your question there.
Oh, are you taking a picture right now? Oh, okay.
Is it like a photo, a candid?
Are you?
These seats are too comfortable for
Right? Like, so you want to be like,
you want to,
Yeah.
and I'm like,
Yeah. Yeah.
too comfortable. I just want to be a little bit uncomfortable to keep you on
Yeah.
your toes.
yeah. Well, I'm pregnant, so I
Hey, who's going to North California were you in?
LA. San Francisco first, and then I went to LA.
Okay. I thought LA was better.
so I'm number 52.
It's warmer.
That's fair. That's fair.
You
Yeah,
grew up in the Bay Area?
I did. Yeah, for the most part. It's
I love it there, but it's, yeah, the weather is,
yeah, even like right now, I think the heat wave is supposed to hit certain parts of the Bay, and like the SF city itself is like 60s. yeah, no,
Being really cold when they moved to San Francisco.
yeah, yeah.
Okay, I think we're ready to move into our Q&A portion. If you're still filling out the survey, that's totally fine. We will be collecting all of them afterwards. So to our virtual attendees, if you have a question, please drop them in the chat box and we will get to you shortly. To our in-person attendees here, I'll actually toss it over to you guys first. So if anyone in the audience has a question, please raise your hand and then we will get to your question. So we're opening up the floor to our in-person audience. If anyone has any questions, please raise your hand.
No, good questions. Start, yes.
Okay, you can go ahead and turn on the microphone on the table and then we'll get to you afterwards.
Great. Hi. I have a question for Shauna. Axios is obviously an important outlet in the city. And I know that they've recently launched Axios Latino, which talks about issues and Latinos and Hispanic Americans face. And I'm just wondering if there's any talk or thoughts about having something similar for the AAPI community.
Thank you. I will bring this back to my bosses. Yeah, we were able to launch Axios Latino about a year or two ago, I think in part because Telemundo approached Axios about a partnership. And so a lot of the resources and funding is shared with the API, community and also just like Black folks, Native American folks. I think the conversation about having a dedicated newsletter has, I think it's there, but right now they have a lot of there's discussion about should we break it out for each community or should we have a dedicated for all of them? Or is it more important to have those, stories kind of interwoven throughout all of our newsletters? So that's kind of the decisions that leadership are going through, but Axios Latino is great. So if y'all are not subscribed, please take a look. Thank you for the question.
Yes, please.
Hi, my question was specifically to Davina. First of all, I found your work on furthering South Asian representation in the political as well as cultural domain very inspiring. And my question was regarding that. Considering the fact that 80% of Asian Americans belong to the upper caste, when you are working towards this advocacy, how do you ensure that you're also taking note of the diversity that exists within this diaspora? Particularly because we're also seeing that, upper caste Indian Americans are gatekeeping institutions to individuals of lower caste. I believe last year we saw, talks by Dalit activists in Google being blockaded by the upper caste. So how could the Asian American community respond to such challenges?
This is a really great question. And this is a topic we covered quite a bit during the Modi visit. So for those of you that are unfamiliar, in India and actually in communities in South Asia, there is the caste system, which while it was abolished hundreds of years ago, still very much exists today. And I think you can see a lot of comparisons to the caste system to privileges that we see in the US. Even if you don't, for example, me, I am a Brahmin Kshatriya woman, I'm Hindu. Even if I specifically am not discriminating based on caste or discriminating based on religion, I personally am benefiting from hundreds of years of caste and religion oppression. And frankly, that might be one of the reasons I'm sitting in this country today. It might be one of the reasons my ancestors were able to come to this country, why when partition happened, they were able to fly on a plane and not via a train. So how are we having these discussions about owning our own privileges, really taking the time to examine that as immigrants, as first generation, second generation, not all immigrants come here on a level playing field. And I think that's really something we need to be examining and acknowledging is what were the systems of oppression that you benefited from generations ago? And are you taking the time to learn your family history? Are you learning the communities that you've come from? So that's the first, is how are you learning that, ensuring that you're not ignorant of your own privilege. The second is how are you working to correct those imbalances? So I personally, through Brown Girl, am ensuring that every time we have a panel, we have somebody of a religious minority that is represented. We have somebody of a caste minority that is always represented. So that's one of the ways in which that I try every day to do that. And then the last is ensuring that you're not weaponizing your privilege. I think it's easy to be ignorant. No judgment. If you don't want to learn about your past, you don't want to learn about it, but don't weaponize that ignorance. So how are we having conversations amongst our own communities in those family WhatsApp groups? How are you reaching out to people individually? I think there are some studies that have said, we can send out a message on a WhatsApp group and it may not have an effect, but to really change somebody's mind, can we be having a one-on-one conversation with them? I'm still struggling with this. I'm still on my own journey to discover this. I think the South Asian, specifically the Indian privileged upper caste Hindu community, has a lot of reckoning to be doing in this. But I think the beginning is starting to have these conversations to at least acknowledge that it exists.
Yes, please. No.
Hello.
There you
Okay.
go.
So earlier Moana was talking about the importance of immersing yourself in community. And just now we were also talking about the diversity of all of the different communities in the AANHPI community. And so I wanted to ask all of the panelists if you've ever had to cover a topic or a community that you're not a part of, and how did you navigate that? And do you have advice for other people who might be in the same position?
Well, I can speak about that. I'm actually working on a project right now. This is the mainstream publisher that has reached out to me. And it is for the Pacific Islander communities that I am not a part of. So I'm very sensitive and careful about how I frame the messaging. There is some fortunate things about it in that like our cultures have similarities. So I try to, like when I'm speaking about culturally sensitive topics, I try to speak on the commonality part. But if there are nuances, and there are always many, I will reach out to community members of those cultures to get their perspective and to kind of assess, like, give them an opportunity to weigh in, like, this is what I'm writing. This is how I am putting this message forward. Is this authentic? Is this something that your community is really feeling? Because for a lot of us, the internet provides a lot of information, but it's not all correct. We all know this. And so while I take a decent amount of information from the internet, especially when you're talking about Pacific Islander cultures, the face-to-face, one-on-one conversations, the oratory nature of the culture, a lot of the stories that are important are not available on the internet. Those are not sources that we would put them on. So the community engagement, and really giving them, a platform to share in the work that you're doing, right? And whether some people will want the credit and some people won't, it's some of that's cultural too. But by doing that, that also helps other people to show and highlight avenues where they could uplift their voice, and have their thoughts and their stories put into spaces and platforms that they would not have thought about for themselves. So that's something I take seriously, even when I'm being approached by people to contract and do work for other entities. I have a very strong filter, especially when it comes to culture, just because like I know how much like a cultural appropriation and appreciation, there's a very fine line there. And it's really important to engage the community experts in that space.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think, I think all journalists today, regardless of your background, you will have to write about, a community that you're not familiar with at some point. And it's your responsibility to do your due diligence and really reach out to people in this community, not just looking at, news articles even, because we all know that can, journalists get that shit wrong too. And so like, if you're looking at columns or news articles, is it written by a person from that community? Are they centering those voices? Making sure that, books, research that you're citing or trying to use, is actually stuff that is cited and used by people from those community or, are written by those folks. And I also think one of the questions I try to ask people a lot, this goes across, it's not necessarily just race related, but even like class or, religion, is how do you think, what are ways that you feel the media, whatever you want, mainstream media, journalists, news articles misrepresent you or your community, your story? And you'll find a lot of people have a lot to say about it, right? Like I would have a lot to say about it. That's like all of, AAJ's like Media Watch, basically, right? Like the different ways that, people are still marginalized by, journalists. So I think that's really important. And just also like that also gives you an into what people care about in their communities too. Issues that you might not even realize are prominent. And so, at the YAPI, like, I definitely like was very ignorant when I first started covering, Native Hawaiians, Pacific Islanders. We had actually done not a great job of, covering those communities, even though from the beginning it was co-founded and labeled as for AAPI politics. And that's something we wanted to really like own. And so, I think I ended up being able to connect with a Chamorro person, an indigenous person from Guam, who's a human rights lawyer, who was advocating for the UN to basically like investigate what folks on the island were calling like, human rights violations because of the US militarization of the island. And that was stuff that I didn't learn about in school, certainly. And, like Naomi said, like was definitely not on the radar of probably even like politicians, right? Even Congress members. So I think that's the thing when you're approaching another community or another experience that's not yours. You're just like, you just have to recognize that your voice or your thoughts, your opinions are not number one or not the priority in it. Actually, like, even if you are going in with certain ideas about how the story will go, that is not what actually matters in the end.
I spent a lot of time asking myself who's not included in this room. At Brown Girl, we really do try to uplift communities that are not being heard. And mostly we do that by shutting up and using the platform to provide that space. So most recently with the Modi visit, I facilitated an Instagram Live to talk about caste, to talk about religious minorities, to talk about political prisoners. And when we were doing the prep call, one of the panelists I had called upon called me out and said, you don't have one Dalit person on this panel. How are you doing a panel on caste and you don't have one Dalit person? And I really appreciated that she called me out on that. And so of course they really made me question. Here I am talking about caste and I haven't included anybody from that community. There's something missing there. But also I think appreciating and recognizing that one person cannot represent and cannot speak for a whole community and not putting that onus on that person. I think I remember once, this was a couple of years ago, I was sitting in on a meeting and somebody was asking, how do I live in a majority Black community. How do I ensure that I'm not the gentrifier? And the person responded with, well, I usually just try to reach out to somebody from that community and get their perspective. And I didn't say anything, but if I could go back in time, I would have spoken up and said, yeah, but that one person is not going to speak for an entire race of people. And it's not fair to tokenize them and put that on them. So again, who's not sitting in this room, but also acknowledging that we can't be putting that much responsibility on any one individual.
Definitely great points and agree with all of them. What I would add is before you engage, observe. There's a lot that you can learn just by observing when you're going, intending to go to a community and approach the situation with humility and openness and being able to explicitly acknowledge what you don't know. I was a policy fellow for a Native Hawaiian organization that was working on ensuring that the Hawaiian homelands was not being built on or leased badly. And I asked my manager at one time, we were going to do consultations with Native Hawaiian communities on Kauai. And I asked my manager, listen, I'm not Pacific Islander. I grew up on Guam. I'm not even Chamorro. I'm definitely not Native Hawaiian. How do I go about engaging Native Hawaiian communities? And that's what she said. Like, tell them that you don't know what you don't know, but you're here to be an ally and to learn. The other thing too is, as you go, I think many of you will be going to maybe to local organizations, or you'll, stay here in DC, is that no matter what national organization you work for, whether you're a volunteer or a staffer, is that that national organization is made up of local organizations and communities. And that's what should be informing your work. And how do you make learning from them part of your professional development? And how do you make what you learn from them part of, and really have the work that you do in DC embody their struggles and their work? So definitely like approach with openness, approach with humility, and learn how to be an ally in the most sincere ways that you can.
So I just want to very quickly jump in. So we have time for one last question before we close out the session. And this is actually from one of our virtual attendees, Kiana. So Kiana asked, to Naomi, but anyone else can also join. I'm not sure how familiar you are with this topic, but last year, Bongbong Marcos was elected in a controversial manner. There are many Filipino people, including family members, who elected him because of the dissatisfaction with mainstream media, as well as being convinced by revisionist history. How can we have productive conversations with family members who are critical of independent journalism while being heavily swayed by biased media that erases important parts of our history, such as enforced disappearances during martial law?
That's deep. That's deep. And I honestly struggle with that pretty much on the daily in terms of seeing my homeland evolve, where nothing in governance has worked to the point where they are dissatisfied enough to want to elect someone with that legacy. And while the sins of the father are not the sins of the son, this is a elected official who is also not acknowledged that that happened. Martial law happened. So that honestly, I calibrate every time, because there are members of my family who, basically say, well, martial law was not so bad. And for me, growing up as a teenager, reading books about martial law and learning about that time in history, that's a tough pill to swallow, because they're like, especially when you're speaking with older generations and you have to be respectful, and they say things like, well, you didn't live through it and you weren't there and you don't know, right? But I think in terms of that dialogue, I think I have not figured that out yet. And I think for me, what I want to focus on is how I am raising my son. What books am I buying before they're banned? That applies to this country too.
Yeah.
What books am I buying at every level, so that he has that history, and talking to him about it. And also the importance too, talking to everyone about the importance, talking with your family members. This happened, Duterte also happened because of disinformation. And I want to make that distinction between misinformation and disinformation. Misinformation may happen per chance virally. Disinformation are strategic campaigns to persuade people with wrong information. And I think that's not only happening in the Philippines. This is a worldwide phenomenon that's happening in many countries across Asia and across our states here too. So I think, I don't necessarily focus on minds that I can't change, but I believe we're going to be talking about this at our convention too, in what are our roles in the API community. I know API Vote is working on this in terms of media literacy, and we're going to be working with them on that. And at AJA, we're going to really unpack this. What is our role as citizens, as journalists, so that we can we can put a stop to this, what is the backstop for disinformation? And that doesn't get to the point about productive dialogue one-on-one, but I really do think besides that, if there is no persuasion to be made with a family member, there are other arenas where you could put your time and energy that work on the institutional change for the long term. That's what I'm thinking today. Yeah.
Thank you so much. That was a tough question to end on. Thank you so much for your thoughtful and candid response. So I really, again, for like the seventh time, want to say thank you to everybody on the panel. So Sojin, Shauna, Davina, Naomi, and Moana, thank you all so much. It was such an illuminating and in-depth conversation, and I think we all got so much out of it. So closing up, we have one final WLP session this summer. It's going to be next Wednesday, July 19th from 6 to 8 p.m. Eastern time. And so it's going to be like this session, in person in DC, as well as available virtually via Zoom. The final WLP session will be on the future of AANHPI and public service, where we're going to talk about the various career pathways within public service and how to bridge AANHPI identity with a career in the public sector. To be plugged into all of the future events that CAPAL will be hosting, you can register on our website at capal.org or on social media at CAPAL-DC and follow along on the social media, tag at CAPAL-DC. And I want to say thank you to our sponsors, Moapia, Comcast, Bonafide Mass, for your continued support and to our programs and continuing to provide opportunities for AANHPI and public service. And a very special thank you to AT&T for allowing us to host our WLP series at this wonderful venue space. I'd like to give a big thank you to our incredible office interns, Sukmani, Rachel, and Kevin, for their amazing work this summer. They've done so much. Yeah. Thank you all so much. And to all of you, thank you for attending our 5th WLP session of the summer. We'll see you at the next session. Thank you so much. Good night.
Can I just mention that I left these postcards for the DC Asian Pacific American Film Festival, which kicks